Yeah. Let's.
Good afternoon. I'm not so good with a microphone. I'm Mary Ann Deffenbaugh. I am the treasurer of the Oregon Alliance, which is this on? Okay. The Oregon Alliance, which of the National Museum for Women in the Arts. And you probably are familiar with the museum. It's in Washington, D.C. There are several chapters in several states and actually several foreign countries as well. And so we're a small group that supports the mothership, as we call the National Museum for Women in the Arts. This is the third lecture in a series of 4 that we are presenting about modern women artists. And we are so delighted to have Bruce Gunther as our speaker today. Most of you know Bruce because he was the chief curator at the Portland Art Museum until 2014 when he retired. However, I don't think talented, polymath talented and ability people really retire. But going back in history, he received his Bachelor's of Art in Applied Design from Southern Oregon University and served with the Volunteers in Service to America in Colorado before beginning his distinguished museum career. He has held positions as director and curator of the Museum of Art at Washington State University in Pullman. He was the curator of contemporary art at the Seattle Art Museum, chief curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and chief curator at the Orange County Museum in Newport Beach, California. He came to the Portland Art Museum, where he actually started way back in the 70s when he was a young intern at the museum. He started at the Portland Art Museum as curator of contemporary art in 2000 and assumed the responsibilities of chief curator the following year. Among his many gifts to our cultural community are the outstanding exhibitions he organized during his tenure at the Portland Art Museum, including Clement Greenberg, A Critic's Collection, and The Unforgettable Disquieted, which featured an international roster of artists that included Sanford Biggers, Tracy Emin, Andreas Gursky, Glenn Ligon, Takashi Murakami, and I'm going to say this name wrong, Maguchi Mutu. I love her work, I just can't say her name. With regular solo exhibitions of work by artists such as Pierre Huguet, Bruce Nauman, and Ursula von Rydingskaard. Bruce offered local audiences a wide window onto the contemporary scene. Of special note, too, is how he rose to the heroic challenges of presenting large-scale sculpture, giving us retrospectives devoted to the likes of Lee Kelly, Gaston Lachaise, and Hilda Morris, some of our local favorites. Currently, he is the adjunct curator at the Oregon Jewish Museum. He continues to inform and educate audiences about modern and contemporary art with exhibitions devoted to important figures such as R.B. Katai, Judy Chicago, and Helen Frankenthaler. I believe that Helen Frankenthaler exhibition is still up, and it is marvelous. Over the course of his career, he has published more than 50 books and exhibition catalogs and enriched our cultural ecosystem by helping to build a number of significant private collections. And some of you may have had his services along those lines. I know I have. With his vast knowledge and sensitive appreciation for sculpture and printmaking techniques, we're fortunate to hear Bruce's insights today on the great Louise Nevelson. And now, please give a warm welcome to Bruce Gunther.
All right, I'm going to adjust the mic slightly and use the basso. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the Alliance for sponsoring this 2-year, 4-lecture series on women who changed 20th century art in America and the world, from the early lectures last year of Sonia Delaunay and Leonora Carrington to this year's American list with Louise Nevelson and Alice Neal in April. It is part of our advocacy and our understanding of the changing history, our histories and the way we tell them, that these women who changed the world around them, changed their media and the mediums they chose and the work they did, that we have to rediscover them generation after generation because they have been excluded from textbooks and lectures and public collections in shocking numbers. And so the Museum for Women in the Arts and soon the National Museum of Women at the Smithsonian will open, and we will see a new blossoming of our awareness of the complete picture of the arts and their development, not only in our own communities, but worldwide. Today, I'm delighted to be able to share with you the work of Louise Nevelson. And the talk is, oh, that's it, don't go out on me. There we go. There's a few technical things. This is designed for a digital generation, and I'm still an analog person, as is inevitably the case. There we go. And so you'll have to excuse me. I'll try not to blind anyone in the front row. Louise Nevelson has been credited with being the most important woman sculptor of the 20th century. And she certainly is the most important American woman sculptor and one of the most important sculptors with Sandy Calder and David Smith, who changed the paradigm of sculpture as we know it. Calder, who set sculpture in motion, David Smith, who moved the factory aesthetic and the direct welding invention of sculpture from the drafting table to the casting yard into the studio and into the streets of America. And Louise Nevelson, who validated wood as a contemporary medium, who changed the notion of how sculpture is built, not carved, with her use of assemblage. And those three individuals rewrote the history of sculpture in America, which had always been secondary to painting. I would challenge anyone in the room to name one significant sculptor pre-1890 in America. They are few and far between, and it is in the 20th century that sculpture takes its new meaning. And so this is one of these challenges where and here we go. Mina and Isaac Berleski were married in Kiev, Ukraine. Isaac was a timber man. He had lumber yards. He harvested wood and shipped it around the Pale of Discovery and Russia and the Central Eastern European. He decided, given the pogroms and the persecution of Jews in the Eastern Central European area, to come to America. He followed his brothers and sisters who had immigrated in the 1880s and 90s when the first pogroms started. And he migrated in 1903 to Rockland, Maine. And it's an odd choice. Most of the Eastern European Jews, and there were over 3 million who came to America from 1880 to 1920, went to New York, and from New York on. He chose Boston, and he then went to Maine. Of course, it's the timber. It's the family business. They were an upper middle class Jewish family and successful business people, and he sought to remake that history in the United States. Louise is born in Kiev in 1899, the second child She is, in this photo, 8 years old. It's 1905 when she and her mother and siblings arrived in America, and they made a photo in this. It's now 1907. A fourth daughter has been born, and the family is established. The lumber businesses are going. The junkyard that he started collecting things to find his footing has happened, and they begin to live an American life. The children learn English. Louise Nevelson was the captain of her women's basketball team. And they find their life in America, immigrants in a Daughters of the American Revolution town, which means, of course, there was a prejudice and a lack of comprehensions of who they were in this small Maine town in Rockland. But she and her siblings became American. They learned English. Her mother never did, and her mother was always locked in what had been, as many immigrant women can be, isolated at home. And but she dressed as an upper middle class Jewish woman would in Kiev, or Warsaw, or Moscow, or Paris, and she brought her children the same way, so that there was always a sense of who we are and how we embrace the world. Music and Louise's interest in art was encouraged. And so when she graduated from high school, she went to work. And it was as her work as a stenographer that she met Charles Nevelson, a New York-based shipping magnate whose family had come to the United States early on and whose ships had been requisitioned for the World War I. And they were repairing their ships in Rockland, and his brother first met Louise and thought, an unmarried woman. And so he sent his youngest brother, Charles, on the next trip to check on the progress of the ships and to buy timber. And it was a match made in the way that matches are traditionally made, between parents and in the community. And so she marries Charles in 1920 and realizes her dream. She moves to New York City and lives on Riverside Drive and is introduced to the world of New York and the arts. She takes classes and she begins to struggle. She has a child, Myron, named a common name Mike Nevelson, who will grow up in a very complicated way. The marriage is difficult. Charles had the expectation of a traditional Jewish bride, and Louise Nevelson had her ideas on being an artist. She studied music. She studied dance for 20 years, modern dance, and knew Martha Graham and people in her life. And the frisson between his family and their expectations of a bourgeois happy life and hers as a bohemian class. She leaves him in 1931. She takes Mike to Maine and deposits him with her mother and family, where he will then go to boarding school and be raised by her extended family, while she goes to Europe to study with Hans Hofmann in Munich in 1931. She'd been told about Hofmann by Chaim Gross at the Art Students League, and she goes to Munich to work with him. It's 1931. Hitler is ascendant. As Nevelson colorfully recalled, she walked by his house every day on the way to the classes with Hans Hofmann. And so after several months, she moves away, and Hofmann moves to the United States. She goes to Paris. She's introduced to people. She goes to the museums, and she returns out of a small sense of guilt about abandoning her child, whom she visits, and then promptly leaves for Paris to to study again before the war closes it down. So she is continuously searching for and trying to find a proper balance between, as Edward Albee said, the container and the thing contained, between the artist as the container and the spirit and the creation of art as the contained. And for her entire first part of her life, she is searching for that harmony in her life that allows her as a creative individual to express that creativity and to make art that is inconsistent with her sensibility and her inner necessity, as Kandinsky called it, to create, to bring the world through the eyes of the artist and their work to the people around her. And so with that she studies voice, acting. And when she's in Europe, she appears in plays in Germany briefly before going to Paris. She herself begins to think about metaphysics. She's a non-observant Jew. I mean, from an Orthodox household. And what that means for those of you who have not had that experience, there's a sense of ritual, of community, of a sense of this continuum of a religious practice that is vested in the Old Testament as we see it as a Jewish Bible. But she begins to look for a larger meaning, a meaning that she can convey through her work that will speak across religions, across parties. And that to find that is for her to begin to circle the idea of someone like Krishnamurti, who was in the 20s and 30s lecturing in America about Eastern philosophy and the symbolism of the circle, that the thought and life circle in their brains. And when she went to study with Hoffman, she discovered the cube and cubism, and suddenly she squares the circle and she finds the place in which she can work. And in that process, she begins to work with modernism, with a sculpture that is, where did it go? There it is. That is abstracted. It's figuratively based. And in this self-portrait, you see her working, which was originally in plaster and was featured in an exhibition for which there was a very telling review. It was part of a group of work that she showed in 1935, and this piece was also shown at the first group exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum that she was included in 1935. And there was a review of this body of plaster work, which this one is a cast bronze now. And in 1941, the review of the Nierendorf Gallery of these plaster works of Nevelson said, "We learned the artist is a woman in time to check our enthusiasm. Had it been otherwise, we might have hailed these sculptural expressions as by a surely great figure among the moderns instead of a woman." And so this is the background. We cannot forget we live in a very different time. And most of us do not have this experience in our lives, although it's still readily available in some circles. She begins to free herself of her entanglements. She divorces Charles Nevelson in 1941. Her family, her mother, had sent her to Europe and continues to give her a small stipend. She is very active in the arts community of New York. She throws herself in. She joins the various artist groups, Artist Equity. She is involved in the sculpture group, and she begins to exhibit a series of works that are, I think, more exploratory. The initial figure I showed you was very figurative and nominal. These are a series of works that are moving, static, moving, and they're in an exhibition at the Grand Central Modern Gallery. And what they do is they are cast stone and terracotta. They're all unified by paint. As you notice, they're segmented on a pipe. And so what happens is those modules move. And so the moving and the static, there is the static position, and then as they're animated by touch, they reconfigure, and the volumes and the information they portray changes. This is one of the figures from that group. Again, a Untitled. She will soon leave the realm of Untitled for the world of innuendo and dream for her titles. But in this case, this work is typical of the work, and what is typical of the work that was shown at the Whitney Biennial. Her first inclusion was in 1947. She was among the oldest participants in the Whitney Biennial. Because in 1947, of course, in 1946, she is 47 years old, and many of the participants were in their 20s and 30s. This will continue for her for a while. Her mother dies in 43, her father dies in 46, and she and her siblings receive an inheritance. She uses that money in 48 and 1952 to go to Mexico to see the Yucatan and the Maya classical period sculpture, and it is revealed in some of the ways she begins to approach her work. She is changing and changed by her life in New York's art scene, and she will change again. Her first museum purchase is of the first personage. It is in an exhibition titled The Forest. One of the things that Nevelson begins to do is to create bodies of work to be seen together. And unlike shows today where we'll see 10 paintings from the same 2 years, her work begins to have thematic context. And this was from an exhibition called The Forest, a series of found wood assembled sculptures painted black. She begins to paint them in an important way at this point in order to remove the importance of color. Now, I'm going to jump into something here that may or may not work since I can barely see this. She decides that the work, she's in this period in New York, until she receives her inheritance, she is in and out of poverty. She lives with friends. She moves frequently. She does what she has to do to survive. She is, a free woman and divorced and aware that she can do this. And so by painting black, the color was not, she chose to mask the source of the wood. You see, so the color was not intended to add meaning, but rather to reduce the choices for the viewer to understanding what they were seeing sculpturally or how the thing would be perceived. And so the black had a philosophical subtlety, I think. It's non-literal. It in sense has a role and a purpose in the work, but it is not describing or is the work. So the use of black has a function, but it's not a fixed symbolic meaning. When we think of drawing of a nude or a classic Japanese or Chinese scroll painting in sumi ink, we don't assume that bamboo is black. They could use the color red, but then you would begin to wonder, well, but why is the bamboo red? Instead of just accepting the drawing of a bamboo that is in black or the drawing of a figure in black and white, we don't expect it to have any meaning. And in this case, she adopts that for her sculpture. And she's also finding her sculptural material. It's the 1940s and into the 50s. The war effort has taken metal to another place. She chooses to work with wood because she doesn't want to work in the factory. She doesn't want to work with flame and the resistance of metal, or the traditional carving of stone. Although she carves marble, she carves wood initially. When she finds the wood that she begins to assemble in these things, she abandons those traditional notions, and she goes to the freedom of being able to work independently and the availability of material from the streets of New York. She uses found material as a source of as free material when she has no income, when she begins to work and develop sculptures in their way. And in this case, you'll notice this is a two-part sculpture. The first personage is two parts. The first part she builds is the secondary, the back piece, the spiky, spiny totemic piece. And that becomes the spirit of this immense slab of wood. This is 6 foot high. She was looking into, you can just perceive a knot where the slab narrows at the top. She talks about when she started painting it black, she suddenly came to that moment where the knot was confronting her at eye level, and she thought for a moment, it's speaking to me, and she quickly finishes painting it. But that becomes the body of the personage, and the secondary piece, the piece behind, becomes a way of understanding something else emotionally. It begins to suggest, I will say personality, but I don't mean personality. What it does is it suggests the edge of this elegantly shaped and lifted up slab. It's about a 3-inch thick slab of wood. I don't know how she got it home. It's not exactly clear, because she's working in her house at that time. I suspect she loaded it on Black Beauty, the Ford station wagon, the black Ford station wagon that she had bought used to go to glean the streets of New York for broken tables, found wood, old crates outside of a produce market, the things that she would load into the station wagon and bring home to be the grist of the creation. And so in this work, there is a sense of interior-exterior created by the positioning of the two pieces 6 inches apart. And I think that becomes an important part of how we begin to understand the relationship she has with the object and the color. It is about nullifying meaning, the mixed woods, and the black unifying without implying some other context for the object by using black. The success she begins to have is an interesting one. Her work becomes a challenge to what people expected sculpture would be, from the small assemblages that were part and parcel of the show that the forest, in which found objects and their spiky presence were there, to the Moon Garden +1. Arguably, this is one of the 5 most important sculpture exhibitions of the 20th century in America. This is a partial view of that exhibition, and it tells us several things. It is an installation. She thought of it as an environment. And so the first thing she did at this gallery was remove all furniture, tables, chairs, and she took the work, moved it in. What you do not see, this is the view from the door, so that as you entered the gallery, you saw in front of you a series of constructions in the middle of the room, and against the back wall, a series of totem and columns. Look at the rectangle in the far back. Do you see the articulation of what looks like a lintel or something? That was the window of the gallery, which she closed and then installed and built a work into the window casing. she took all of the lights down. Her intention was that you would experience the room in the half-light of dawn, that you would experience this as a series of shapes, shadows, and silhouettes in the space. The wall behind us, or as we're standing in the room, was covered in boxes that had intense collages and assemblages inside of them, and they would become a series of work called sky cathedrals. They were on two walls, to the right of the doorway and along the wall beside us to the left. And so those works become enveloping walls of notation. This work, Sky Cathedral 1, was purchased by MoMA following the exhibition. And I think what happens here is you begin to understand the complexity of what she was inventing and why we call it the first real installation. Because what you experienced had never been seen before. An artist who takes the space and animates it from mid-room to the walls, and would eventually begin to use the ceiling, and things would come down from the ceiling, so that you were in an environment, happily, just before the opening, conferring with the director of the gallery and the young fellow who was her assistant, they sort of decided that maybe they needed some light. I think the director backing into one of those sharp, jagged pieces of wood helped that matter. But so they go out and they buy blue light bulbs, blue theatrical lights, which they installed 4 of in the room. So the room took on a light not unlike we're sitting in which the mystery and the depth of the field of experience was limited by your optical access to it. And so suddenly you were inside of a moonscape, a dark space in which dream and the imagination could live. Hilton Kramer, who I never agreed with when I was reading him in the Times in the 60s and 70s until he finally retired in the 80s, said that, Moon Garden by Nevelson is a place of dreams, a dark place of loneliness and longing, of dreams beyond the present. And in thinking about this wall, when you see that 2 of the walls were covered as this is 11 and a half feet high by 10 foot wide. And you'll notice the construction. This is where the real texture of this exhibition happens. Every piece of wood is broken and is found. The boxes themselves are various sizes because they incorporate lug boxes, as we see in the orchards of the Northwest, the produce crates, slatted wood, delivery slats, and a series of half-made boxes. They are stacked. You'll notice in the center of the work a series of white spaces. That's where the boxes do not fit together tightly, because in the stacking, and you have to think of this woman kind of lifting these things above her head, tightening them into the wall. They were not attached to each other. They did not, by the way, have Velcro or Gorilla Tape at this point. They were loose, and so the exhibition happened. The works are created in a studio, but when you go into the studio, into the gallery, she would bring the crates, the boxes, the columns, the totems, and they would begin to assemble them to replicate what had happened in the studio. And so there is a sense of spontaneity and mobility, so that this dreamscape becomes literally what it is, a series of components and vocabularies in which the spirit of the moment, the spirit of the installation, the spirit of the artist is there to animate and to provide us with a sense of structure. Let's see how I did I miss? I missed. I'm going to go back just a second. This is Moon Fountain. We saw it in the center, just in front of the window. And so there were independent pieces standing in the room. Again, box structures built out, applied found wood, all of it painted black. And Nevelson's process at this point begins to develop. The wood she finds on the street is taken home, and before it becomes a work of art, she paints it. So she isn't referencing the remnants of whatever the thing had been that she found the fragment of, but it became like a mosaic, a piece of wood that goes into place. And so we find in this piece and in the subsequent walls this building up. The back of crates, notice the lower right-hand corner of this work, Sky Cathedral, which is in the MoCA collection in LA, the use of found templates. She was scavenging in the industrial areas of New York in the Ford station wagon and finding the work that was wood that was put out, flawed pieces of furniture, the parts that you trim it around. This is like the part of the cookie dough I used to love where you cut the cookies out and then or the biscuits, and then there's the bits around the can. She was finding those wood pieces, and they become then a way of introducing pattern and rhythm into the surfaces. They have this kind of little musical notation that you see, as well as the linear patterning of repeated forms, whether it's 2 table legs from a broken table, a series of spindles from a house that's being torn down. The remodeling and rebuilding of Manhattan was going on at this moment between the wars, and there were spindles and staircases and railings galore on the streets as people were just demolishing houses and rebuilding the city. Sky Columns Present is 1959. It is a continuation of this, and this shows what happens in the gallery installation. She has now added painting the walls black. You notice in the center? So there are walls in which the totems are seen against white, but there are also walls in which the whole experience is the wall. The surface becomes this kind of niches and containers and discovery. You experience it, and you have nothing to reference except what you're seeing and how you experience and understand shadow and light, form and silhouette. I think it's important. The exhibition in 1958, Moon Garden 1, and this exhibit, the Sky Columns Present, which was at the Martha Jackson Gallery, one of the great modernist galleries who helped birth abstract expressionism, meant that she had been invited to be part of the 16 Americans exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And she would create one of the most talked about sculpture installations of her time. And I get to there. Where am I going? There, wrong. One more. This is one of these, there is no mouse that works. Here we are. Dawn's Wedding Feast. It was the largest room at MoMA devoted to the 16 American exhibition. This was an exhibition that included Jasper Johns, Clement, Robert Rauschenberg, Jackson Pollock. It was the sort of the avant-garde edge as the Museum of Modern Art saw it in New York at the time. And this is a view from when you entered her room. And what it was a meditation on white. She decided instead of the black that she was becoming known for and what the museum expected to receive, they received a bright white series of works that have associations. White for Nevelson, I think, is a very interesting choice because she has a sense of how white is an evocation of the light. She associates that moment between dream and consciousness, between the night and the day as the coming of the light. It's almost biblical sounding, but the sense that white opens the door to possibility. It opens the door to the energy of the sun. And so she wanted this meditation on a wedding and the phenomenon of dawn to be both a feast for the eyes and literally a series of feasts. So here, when you walked in the room, you saw these two totemic figures, almost 9.5 feet tall, in the foreground, and then wrapping the room, a series of white boxed structures filled with complex bric-a-brac, Victorian decoration, the porch railings and things, and industrial forms. And then and then this is the view once you move past those two figures. You saw a box on the ground that's the Dawn's pillow, the series of totems. Behind us in this point is another wall filled with white boxes. So for the first time, New York as a whole, the people who go to MoMA, the international visitors, saw an installation, a true installation. The white walls, the white work, the white boxes, was dealt with as an environment, an artist-created environment in which individual works of art are subsumed into a notion and an experience that is important. Let's see. Okay, well, we've used up this hour. Okay. So there is in this is how do you understand this in contemporary terms? Nevelson is the source for installations that would dominate the world, and it is in that notion of what is the place of art that's important. And I think here it's interesting to think about the notion of changing the dialogue. There's something in Hegelian philosophy, dialectics, in which the word offenben has three meanings for Hegel. Something is preserved, something is negated, and something is transcended. And in that, to experience offenben is to understand how we experience Nevelson. There are three levels of consciousness represented by this to Hegel, and he talks about that to experience this experience, which is the totality of the possibility of human experience, one must see something preserved, but at the same time understand that it is negated and that it is transcended. And so in many ways, it is the place that Nevelson herself had looked for a long time, in which color and object becomes a space between what is and what could be. And here, this is the same, something is preserved, a broken chair leg, that we recognize is a chair leg, and it has been negated by being painted black. So the identity of the fragments that make up the work have been transformed, and they represent and preserved by the work, and at the same time, our experiencing of it, which goes into the filtration of our associations, our emotional state, and the energy with which the artist creates the work, I think is something that it makes it a very Hegelian kind of notion about how we understand what the work is. Nevelson talks about identifying with the ocean and the flowing into creativity that the water represents, so that I begin to stack my sculptures into an environment. It is natural, it is a flowing energy, and yet it is also an energy shaped by an intelligence and a compositional experience that gives us quiet spaces and complex spaces, patterns and repetition, shadow and openings. And these become the important part of what is something Greenberg criticized. This is the moment of Clement Greenberg. This is 1959. Clement Greenberg is at his height. He writes a book and he demands the autonomy of different media. And he mentions Nevelson as, Nevelson, who was defining historic traditional definitions of sculpture, three-dimensional, painting, two-dimensional. Because Greenberg maintained painting is flat and sculpture by its nature is three-dimensional. Nevelson says the world is round and I will work on the wall, off the ceiling, on the floor, dimensional, it will be painted, it will be flat. And so Greenberg, in writing this essay on the nature of art and the importance of the autonomy of different media, remember he's color field painting and Jackson Pollock as action painter, the paintings are flat but dynamic. He allows that assemblage, as practiced by Louise Nevelson, creates a three-dimensional art that is intimate with pictorial content and denies itself. It denies its autonomy as one medium or another, but is in fact a third way. What Nevelson has always looked for in trying to discover in her work the place between action, inaction, the world and life, the experience and dream, all of those things that are dawns and dusks, the land, the sea, the sky and the land, all of those places that are between those two fixed places, which Clement Greenberg would have had us expect to be flat painting and three-dimensional sculpture. And so in that sense, we move on. This is the moment. Dawn's Wedding Feast created an international interest in her work. She began in 1958-59 to exhibit in Europe. She would go on into the present day, being a darling and not forgotten, as America has forgotten her, as an innovator in the world of sculpture. America, Dawn, 1962. This incorporates a number of pieces from Dawn's Wedding Chapel. The problem with Dawn's Wedding Chapel, she wanted it to be bought by the Museum of Modern Art. And the curator wanted to buy it, but no one else did. So it went back to her studio, and because nothing was screwed together, it began to find its voice in other places. People in the first 3 or 4 years after the show were able to buy a section of it, let's see, I touched it too softly. Like Dawn's Wedding Chapel was a section of the wall that the Whitney managed to buy, but it soon became loose ends, the columns, the presence of the piece as it opens up. This was, the Art Institute of Chicago bought this, and so it's America, the Dawn. Her poetry and the politics of her titles always begin to lean toward the poetic. I have created a Nevelson inadvertently with my talk. This craziness. She moves on at this point to create the gold works. These were controversial, but she wanted to summon the sun. She wanted to talk about, she had talked about the moon in a way with Dawn's Wedding Chapel and with the black and the night, but she wanted to claim collective memories of magnificence, whether it's the intricate ritual objects of Jewish spiritual rites or the Medjajar architecture that traveled with the Sephardim from Spain to Eastern Europe. It becomes part and parcel of a new continent, a new way of thinking. And these works, I would point out, this is the first work she creates where all the boxes are the same size. You've been seeing things in which the variation will go, across the scale of 1 to 4. And here, they're all the same size. They're all handmade, and they're all found, but she kept enough to make this work as a unified piece. The complexity of the Royal Tides series, and there's some 35 of them in the world, was this ongoing moment. It's gold paint. It's gilt. It is an extreme. It is the other edge between white and black. Black, which is all colors and the night. Light, which is the brilliance of movement and air and the sun, becomes gold, and it is in its artifacts and its remnants that we find a new meaning. It is also, as she said, we were promised that all the streets in America were paved with gold. And this is an immigrant woman who spent 40 years in poverty before her work began to sell and her recognition met her. This work is in 1961. She is a 60-year-old woman when she exhibits and has her break at MoMA. Everyone else is 25, 30, 35. And so it is a moment in which she is a senior person and the most important sculptor working, because she, more than anyone, has found a place to go. She represents the United States at the Venice Biennale with a work like this. If any of you have ever been to the Biennale, this is so white privilege. There, you enter the pavilion and there's an oval room, and then there are 2 large rooms, one to the left, one to the right. She was given that space. The entry was gold. The walls were painted gold, and this work, along with 3 others, were in the space. So what you entered when you came off that dusty path to the pavilion door, you were immersed in a Alibab's cave of splendor. And then each side then, one was black and one was white. You would fall into the night, and then you would rise with the dawn to the light of works that came and filled the Biennale in 1962. When this work was done, and here you see for the first time, and this is important, she begins to make a change in how she works. And we begin to see her using manufactured boxes. Notice they're all the same module. And there's now a growing predominance of flat cut shapes. She has the money, finally, to begin to buy and to supplement the scrap with material that is new and respects that she can draw a silhouette and have it cut 20 times. And that becomes the voice of the work as she's creating it. And so in this one, the nooks and crannies of New Continent have a very pronounced and multi-plane surface in which the entry to the box, notice the boxes almost entirely, have a plane of flat color, white, at the entrance to the box, and then your eye dips behind it. You discover gesture and form and shadow inside each box. So the work then is not unlike a great wooden poem. Each box is a stanza, and each piece of wood is a word. And so from in container to container, across, down, diagonally, there is the untethered notion of the tumble of a poem, starting, dipping, continuing. It is as if memory and dream, trance and prayer have metamorphosed to alter the space with a mysterious force of discovery, with a mysterious force of notion. It is in the period, she is growing in stature. She is receiving all sorts of awards. I'm rushing a little bit, but I'm going to hit all of it. You're going to have to sit here just for a second more. This vocabulary change is prevalent in one of the early private commissions. This is Temple Bethel in Great Neck, New York. And in this work, a number of things are evident. The bema wall, the bema is the platform from which the Torah is read. And that bema wall is a series of the same size module moving across. and without the diversion of the fragmentary bits of furniture, knobs, finials. It's a series of cut shapes in an 8-inch deep box, so that what you get is the flickering reflection and silhouette and shadow of these curvilinear forms as they move across and down the wall of the bima, for the bima. The Ark of the Torah is in the center. You see the stair step against the gold carpet. That opens to reveal the Torah, which is then carried to the podium and read. And then the eternal light that is a fixture to notify the presence of the community and of God is up above. It is I think one of the most austere and elegant of places. The title, The White Flame of 6 Million, a choice to acknowledge the Holocaust, but without the Sturm und Drang of what could disrupt the meditation that the temple and the process of experiencing spiritual enlightenment could contain. This is in 1970-71. In 77, she will do a Lutheran chapel on Madison Avenue in New York for St. Peter's. And it is an intimate it's a pentagram shape, vaguely, architectural, in which all of the walls are addressed with her box-like wall-hung assemblages. And so its space, not unlike this, but very different, is filled with the universe that she creates in these boxes. Again with light, because the spiritual notion she has, like the metamorphosis and metaphysics that she studies, is about the opening up of the body and the spirit to the power of suggestion. She, in 1973, is at the height of her international reputation. She is the subject of a series of exhibitions from across the 60s. 1964 Documenta, where she will appear in Kassel 3 times, the 67 Whitney retrospective, the 69 Houston MFA retrospective, the 1973 survey of her wood sculptures at the Walker Art Institute. She is the most well-known and collected sculptor in America and woman. And so it is in that sense that we begin to see her talking about and experiencing the possibilities of her work. And so she moves toward public art. And it is in the early 70s. In 1972, the GSA establishes the Art and Architecture Program, and a series of states begin to follow suit, creating art in public places programs. Portland, Oregon, and Washington State have these programs. We've never managed to commission anything quite this grand, but we're trying. And this is a night presence from 1972. It was fabricated in Corten steel, then a new art material by Lippincott. And she develops a relationship. Her work has been about the hand of the artist, about finding, transforming, assembling, experiencing, and translating directly as an artist into something. Here, there is an intersection. She's working with metal which she had never wanted to work with, but she is not welding it. And there is a wonderful film of her working at Lippincott, which I encourage you to go find, in which she is there with her inevitable cigarello or cigarette in hand, working with these men. Dear, could you move that to the left? Can you hold this up? No, up a little more. And she moves back. Now, bend it. Can you bend it, Jeff? And she is working with a surrogate set of hands and a series of people who understand and care to translate this voice. And so in this work, which is a hollow form, it takes its inspiration from a work from the late 40s, one of her assemblages, and it is 12 and a half feet high. No, I think I just gave you the wrong dimension. It's perhaps bigger than that. I think it's about 20 feet high, actually. And it's on Park Avenue at about 92nd. And what it creates is a sense of what all Nevelsons are about. They tend to have a sense of the edge, the frame, the box, the kind of waving shapes that open, an aperture, and then that which is gathered together in its huddling masses, and here almost a bird-like form against these knobs broken. It has both decorative power and mystery. And so as she works in metal, things take on. She is the only woman commissioned by the federal government to celebrate the bicentennial. Her work in Philadelphia, called the Bicentennial Dawn, is unveiled in January of 1976. Betty Ford attends, the head of the GSA, and the NEA are there in presence. And in this work, which has 29 components, you see her creating clusters, villages, communities of work in which the form lifts and opens up in a kind of an exciting and I think optimistic way. This is also the year that she does the great Embarcadero tree. If you've been to Embarcadero Center in San Francisco, there is a Nevelson in the middle of the Embarcadero Center that's 55 feet high. It is the tallest work she ever creates. And it covers 3 floors of the center through a hole in the middle. And it defines and redefines and opens a sense of, I'm always surprised at how its energy kind of erupts out of the ground and comes up through the, and people don't know it's by a woman. And people don't understand what it represents for an achievement that takes us beyond the sense of it. In 1978, New York City invites her to create Nevelson Plaza, the only public space at that point dedicated, named for an artist, and for whom the artist created the landscaping, the benches, and the art that filled it. A work called Shadows and Flags. These items are about 20 to 22 feet high, and they announce the piece of property, which is a large triangle. It's near the, for those of you who are in New York often, or can see it, it's near the Federal the Federal Reserve Building. And what you have is a series, she's taken metal, and where her wood pieces had the obdurance of the found, the broken and the discarded, and given new presence and a new order to themselves. And her public sculptures begin to have this liberty. And here, it's the notion of a shadow moving, of a flag fluttering. And she makes Corten steel a silken ribbon, an arabesque in the sky, a notion of trees in the wind, flags in a celebratory place, a place in which you move, it lifts you into the air and against the buildings around you toward the sky. And the final piece against the reserve building is over 40 feet high. It reaches and stretches up into the sky. A series of, like all of her work, that relies on silhouette, plane, shadow, mystery. You discover and rediscover. None of them are the same as you move around them. None of them are predictable. They are a discovery and a way of invention that becomes an important part of what she is about and how she thinks about the experience. This is the largest work she ever creates. It's Mrs. N's palace. It is her dream of the environments she creates. She every time she makes a major installation work, an environment at a gallery, in a museum, they've been dispersed in her career. And so in 1977, she creates Mrs. N's Palace. It contains work created across her career. It is as if at 78, she is making a summary, her own kind of notion about who she has been, and it's a cenotaph. You can enter it. You see the doorway in the middle of this slide. You enter on a gridded, mirrored floor so that light that hits from the doorway onto the mirror illuminates the spaces. There's a complex sort of twist of 3 spaces inside this 20-foot by 15-foot box, which she had a carpenter make for her, and then she began to fill it and attach it. It's 12 feet high. And so when you go into it, you begin to dance in the dreams and the life she's created. You know, it's all black. It is her space, her like her early works, it fills and reflects a narrative, her personal narrative, and her metaphysical symbology. You know, they are both about a woman who is an immigrant, who lost her grounding, who refines her father, who invents her life in America, who becomes the most famous person making sculpture in America for 20 years. Her final works, a series called Mirror and Shadow. Interestingly, there are a few 3-dimensional things, but the core of this body of work she makes in her 80s are on the wall. This is 8 foot by 8 foot, by the way. You see the edge of the grid as the stabilizing point on the wall. And against it, there are sheets and door-size assemblages that have been attached. And her compositional notion has changed. And we saw it first in the diagonals and the zigzags on Mrs. N's Palace. Those kind of hexagons, the diagonal zigzagging boxes, all of which were fabricated to her specifications and become part of it. So that the energy in the Mrs. N's Palace finds its final mirroring in the mirror and shadows. She begins to loosen and expand into the world in a different kind of way. It is the assurance of age. It is the possibility of invention once again in her world that allows her search for this universal voice, for this notion of what happens to be there. And so in these works, I'm particularly taken with the way she balances circle and square, linear, straight material against knobs. The found material are present, as is the fabricated work. This work, Mirror Shadow 41, 1987, the year before she dies. She's diagnosed with cancer in this year and will die in 88 April. But here, as an 88-year-old, she is making a work that suggests the kind of explorer, the space, the kind of rhythm of something that is like the clatter of, dentures in a mouth. They take on this kind of rhythm. She's struggling against them. Found shapes that begin to suggest animal hides, musical instruments, sound, light, discovery, dream. It is the gift and the importance of Louise Nevelson. She changed sculpture by her validation and her embrace of wood and assemblage. Unlike anyone else who had practiced it before her, she took it off the wall, into the floor, into the world. She made it a universal by denying the materiality of the assembled parts so that they were free to take on a meaning that reflected her emotional narrative about her life, about her failed marriage, her ideal marriage, her embrace of the spiritual world beyond, the light that fills the heart and the mind and motors life. And in the final stages, she comes back to the moment where she's touching every stick that goes on the wall. Every part of the mirror and shadow has been in her hand and has been transferred to a place where we can discover it and find our own dream, our own sense of possibility. Thank you. If I have to.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, it's 3:15.
I know, yeah.
I'm happy to answer a question if I can. You can offer me. Yeah. I'll repeat it if you want to, but yeah. Okay.
Mr. Gunther has agreed to a very short question and answer period. So, testing.
There you go.
If you raise your hand, I'll come by with the mic so we can all hear the question. I saw your hand first.
What happened to Myron?
Myron is still alive. After a battle with the woman who was Nevelson's assistant and companion for 30 years, he has settled down and made a settlement over her estate, which he locked up in legal cases for 7 years. He's still with us. He probably became a dentist. I'm not really sure what he's doing. He is not in the arts. He knows.
You had a question.
Just informational. Where is Enns Palace?
Oh, the Metropolitan Museum of Art
it's in New
owns
York.
it. It's not currently on view, but it is periodically a centerpiece of the mid-century American abstract expressionist galleries. And they do allow limited access for, one or two people at a time to go inside. It's an amazing experience because of the way the light bounces up into it. It's like stage lighting. You get this underlighting, so you get the kind of physicality of it and the mystery of what you can't see because the light is so limited inside. It's really quite nice. But it is at the Met.
Another question.
A comment. Can you imagine if Nevelson made the chairs in the Temple Bethel? How cool would that be, right?
Yes. I think, in fact, she had a hand in choosing those chairs because those chairs are also in the Lutheran Chapel in 77 in New York. And so I think they represent an agreement between the temple, the church, the architect, and the artist. She picked out the benches in Nevelson Plaza, and she was empowered to pick out the chairs. And so that
Awesome.
those very cubic, box-like forms were her choice, again, to play off the sculptures. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Another question. She is not welding. How is she putting these pieces together?
The old way, with pegs, screws, glue. She starts fastening them together after the Royal Tide Gold Works, or with the Royal Tide Gold Works. She decides that she doesn't like the way people restack them because they're not they don't follow the photograph they were given by the dealer. And so that some things, and it happened in one of the pieces I saw at the Houston retrospective, the Fort Worth retrospective at the Amon Carter. They had misinstalled one of the white pieces, which was not put together with screws, and they had flipped it and set it over one box. When I compared it to the photo I had from a Pace Gallery catalog, and I thought, aha, this is why, for Nevelson, to begin with, no one, they didn't have a place to live. And so she could stack them more efficiently if they weren't put together. But once she started, then they were screwed, and then they were screwed together in units so that you'll see the stack will be together, and they're having assembled them, because I showed her work in 1980 at the Seattle Art Museum. There are some kind of primitive twist latches, like those pieces of wood you put on an old door at a cabin, and some of those lock together the pieces. So again, it's very much her independence and her vision meant she didn't want that kind of apparatus that artists today expect. Jeff Koons never makes his work. He supervises his work. And so it was another world, and a kind of an excitingly free place. So, there's one more. Okay.
Bruce, I was just wondering about the term bricolage, if you could explain that.
Well, bricolage is a French term that has migrated, which means making do with what you have. And it migrated into the art world to accommodate this kind of work, where you take found objects and things you shape and you make something into it. Cornell, who made little boxes with cloying birds and postcards, or a number of artists use bricolage. Viola Fry in the Bay Area, who makes ceramic sculptures using found figurines as well as clay objects that she builds herself and then glues them all together. It's a way of bringing together diverse and different kind of pieces together. But it's a French term from, before the structuralists got a hold of art history.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
My pleasure.